Hello, my name is Lane Schwartz. I want to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging the native peoples of Alaska and Illinois, on whose lands I have lived and worked, most especially the Yupik people of St. Lawrence Island, Alaska, with whom it is my great honor to work. Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, I was studying abroad in Europe, and I went to Greece. I stopped by Athens and wanted to see the Parthenon. Specifically, I wanted to see the Parthenon frieze, which I had learned about during my first semester as an undergraduate in college. Unfortunately, it wasn't there. I later saw it once I returned to England and visited the British Museum, because the Parthenon frieze is in London, where it was given a new name, the Elgin Marbles, after the English lord who took the marbles, the Parthenon frieze, from Athens to London. A recent former director of the British Museum made the astonishing claim, the Elgin Marbles are no longer part of the story of the Parthenon. They are now part of another story. What is that other story? Well, it's the story of colonialism, of cultural domination, and cultural strip mining. Today, I want to make you aware that there are common NLP practices that perpetuate colonialism. I'll ask you to look in the paper for a lot of the details, but today I want to especially warn you of the danger of cultural data mining, and specifically how not to be an NLP colonist. The core message comes down to this Latin phrase, primum non nocere, or in English, above all, do no harm. Today I want to introduce you to the ABCs of ethical research involving Indigenous data, Indigenous languages, and Indigenous people. Let's get ourselves ready by doing a centering exercise. Literally centering. So here's a map of the world, very similar to what I saw on the classrooms in my elementary schools when I was growing up. This is a slightly more modern version that doesn't have the geographical distortion showing Greenland the same size as Africa. But what's in the center? Well, London, of course. London is the center of the world. The prime meridian goes right through Greenwich Observatory in London. When I was growing up in Western Alaska in the Bering Straits region, London was very much not the center of my world. So let's center things to be a little less focused on London. Here's a different world map, one that I like much better. In this one, not only do we not have the geographical distortions of Greenland versus Africa, but we also have a much more balanced view of the world. And it just so happens that St. Lawrence Island, where I do my work and where I began school, happens to be in the center. A key task that we can do in order to center the languages that we work with is to explicitly name them. This is called the Bender Rule, after Emily Bender. And it says, always name the languages you work with. For a group that calls itself the Association for Computational Linguistics, we shouldn't have to say this out loud, but we do. When I took a look at over 9,000 recent ACL papers, the good news was I found that 18 different language families were represented. But the bad news is, of over 9,000 ACL papers, over 83% of them fail to mention a language at all, and implicitly assume English. When we take into account those that explicitly mention English and other languages, over 97% of the papers are about or assume Indo-European, which is the language family that includes English. There are a few more papers, not a lot, but some, that study Chinese, Japanese, or Semitic languages. All of the other languages, all of the other language families are represented in less than 0.5% of the papers examined. This type of homogeneity is bad for science. And unquestioned assumptions make for unethical science. So let's introduce the ABCs of ethical research involving indigenous languages. Do no harm is the ethical foundation. Everything else is built on this. Ethical research is not possible without this foundation. This comes down to, don't harm the people whose languages you work with. Don't perpetuate extractive colonial practices. So what are those extractive colonial practices? Well, cognizance is next. You as a researcher must educate yourself. In order to challenge extractive colonial practices, you first have to know what these practices look like. This gets you on the first step toward ethical research. Let's call this bronze level ethical adherence. Beneficence is next. If you want to work in this space with Indigenous peoples and their languages, make sure that your work is wanted by and directly usable by the community that you serve. Let's call this silver level ethical adherence. Accountability is next. If you are an outsider who wants to work in this space, it is absolutely critical to build relationships with the community and to be held accountable to those sovereign Indigenous authorities. The ABCs of ethical research. This is closely tied in with ideas from Indigenous studies: respect, responsibility, relationships, and reciprocity. These are key in dealing ethically with Indigenous communities. Respecting them, knowing your responsibilities, building relationships. Relationships are key. And knowing your reciprocal responsibilities to that community. I recommend these readings as next steps: Research as Ceremony, Decolonializing Methodologies, as well as these papers by Stephen Bird and Emily Bender. Thank you very much, and I hope you the best.